The deeper we dig into the New York State Department of Corrections, the more it begins to feel like a modern day Game of Thrones. Opposing forces and passed down kingdoms in opposition to each other, littered with the blood and bodies of inmates and corrections officers, who also have opposed Daniel Monticello III. Correction officers claim unsafe working conditions and being used as a means to an end. In all this, one man stands alone. The current head of the New York State Department of Corrections, Daniel Monticello III. This article is about his kingdom, his history. One caveat: this is a longer article I'm reading and a longer video. Feel free to play the video at a higher speed. I will be throwing in my commentary throughout. When I do, I will say pause and we'll be saying back to the article when I'm going back to the article. Enjoy. New prison chief is a son of the system. For Daniel Monticello III, New York prisons are a family business. Chris Gelardi, June 28th, 2023. Now, some of you might be saying, Fred, why are you going over an older article? One thing that everyone has to understand is that sometimes these articles are very similar to finding something very valuable in your attic or in your basement. These older articles tell us a story. They tell us a story, and sometimes they mean more in the future. So we can take a look back to see what was reported and what was happening during that time. You might say Daniel Martuscello III was born to run New York prisons. His father was a prison superintendent. Four of his younger siblings and an in-law work for the prison system. At least three more used to. And when Martuscello took over as head of the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, DOCCS, earlier this month, he had a brother and a sister flanking him in the agency's executive offices, both recently made assistant commissioners. Formerly DOCCS second in command, Martuscello took the reins from his old boss, Anthony Annucci, on June 9th. Annucci spent nearly 4 decades at the agency, including as its top lawyer, and his tenure as chief saw widespread officer abuse, cruel conditions, and deep resistance to oversight. He earned a reputation as a prison institutionalist. Yet, Martuscello, eldest son of an Empire State prison dynasty, is even more rooted in the system. His family is established and ascendant, climbing DOCCS ranks while New York authorities take the agency to task. Martuscello's family has had particular influence among DOCCS embattled Internal Investigations Department, which saw a series of scandals in the 2010s. A state investigation unearthed allegations that Martuscello's brother, a former investigator and now assistant commissioner, tampered with his personnel records. DOCCS said the allegations were unfounded. When the agency overhauled the department, Martuscello became a public face of the agency's attempt to fix itself. It's unclear what impact the agency's attempted reforms have had. Media and state investigations suggest that DOCCS remains lax on corrections officer misconduct, nor is it clear how long Martuscello will lead DOCCS. The title he assumed, acting commissioner, is legally temporary, but Annucci was able to keep it for a full decade. Governor Kathy Hochul's office wouldn't say when she planned to nominate a permanent successor, nor whether Martuscello is on the short list. Pause. So we know that Martuscello was made the commissioner officially, I believe it was in May of 2024. Back to the article. Julia Salazar, the chair of a key Senate committee that would consider a nomination, urged Hochul to look for outside leadership, appointing the second person in line who's been present for all of that stagnation would be a disservice to the department, she told New York Focus. Pause. So we're seeing that Julia Salazar had made comments not endorsing Martuscello for the role since he was a person that's been in the Department of Corrections for some time. It seems like she thought it might be beneficial to bring an outside person in to help clean the Department of Corrections up. Back to the article. Some watchdogs who have worked closely with Martuscello express optimism about his tenure, however temporary. He has been very forthcoming and receptive to our concerns, said Karen Murtaugh, Executive Director of Prisoners Legal Services of New York. Jennifer Scaife, Executive Director of the Correctional Association of New York, described him as accessible, forthright, extremely competent, and an effective communicator. He knows docs from top to bottom, Scaife said. Others see that as part of the problem. Quote, this entrenched, maybe even inappropriate cross-family connection is frankly alarming, said Serena Martin Ligori, a former associate director at the Correctional Association and now executive director of New Hour, a support organization for women and children impacted by incarceration. Docs pointed out that it's common for law enforcement, particularly prisons, to be a family affair, but that fuels a culture of impunity, said Martin Ligori, who attended monitoring visits for the Correctional Association and has been incarcerated in New York herself. I've seen it firsthand, she said. Abuse of incarcerated people often went unaddressed because there were so many officers who were married to each other, related to each other. It's almost impossible with that conflict of interest. The nepotism of it all creates the opportunity. In a statement, Doc said that Martuscello's, quote, have dedicated their lives to public service and are proud of their work in docs, end quote. The agency said that Martuscello has an affidavit on file that defers any quote unquote employment related matters involving his family to the department's general counsel. Asked if the new chief would speak with New York Focus, Doc said, we respectfully decline the interview. The Martuscello prison legacy began in the late 1960s when Martuscello's father, Daniel Jr., started work as a corrections officer. Over nearly 5 decades, he rose through the prison and parole agency, holding every security title according to his obituary, until he was appointed superintendent of Coxsackie Correctional Facility, a maximum security men's prison in the northern Hudson Valley. Daniel Jr. had 6 children, the first of whom was Daniel III. The second born, Christopher, eventually joined Doc's Internal Investigations Department, while the third, Catherine, joined the Prison Nursing Corps. His next daughter, Angela, didn't get a job with Docs herself, according to available records, but she married a Coxsackie guard, and his 2 youngest started with Docs as teachers in the early 2010s. So this article has an interesting, almost like a family tree, showing the quote unquote the Martuscello family prison dynasty with various family members who were employed by Docs, their respective roles. So here we see Daniel Martuscello III, his progression with the Department of Corrections. You know, it's showing Christopher Martuscello, his brother, showing other family members and their respective roles. I am not going to go through each one. The article's linked. You can jump back to this article to go through this with a fine-tooth comb. But I just want to highlight this piece of the article for you. I thought it was interesting, and it looks like a cool infographic. Martuscello kicked off his prison agency career as a corrections officer in 1997. 4 years later, he moved to administration. eventually getting bumped to manage all personnel matters as Director of Human Resources. In 2014, scandal roiled DOC's Internal Investigations Department. The State Inspector General and Attorney General found that the office tasked with uncovering prison agency misconduct was mirrored in its own slew of sexual misconduct cases and cover-ups. Two Martuscellos were allegedly implicated. According to records obtained by the Albany Times-Union, a witness claimed that Christopher, then a deputy in the investigative department's narcotics unit, had likely tampered with Martuscello's personnel records in 2011, while state officials were vetting one of his promotions. Docs told New York Focus that the Inspector General deemed those allegations, quote unquote, unfounded. In 2010, Daniel Jr., the father and then still Kaksaki superintendent, supposedly had a woman acquaintance whom he had hired sleeping in his office and sharing his parking space. When the witness, a member of the investigative office, sent someone to poke around, he said that Daniel Jr. berated him and told him that he could no longer file for overtime pay. Pause. In the HR world, we call this retaliation. Back to the article. Docs investigated those allegations itself, finding the woman guilty of time and attendance abuse, for which she was fined $450 and parking in Daniel Jr.'s spot, the agency told New York Focus. She resigned before Docs could interview her about sleeping in his office, so those charges went unsubstantiated. Docs investigators found no wrongdoing on Daniel Jr.'s part. The investigations department, state inspectors concluded was right. So when Anucci, Martuscello's old boss, took over Docs a decade ago, he undertook a major overhaul. He brought in outside leadership and renamed the branch the Office of Special Investigations, promising greater accountability and professionalism. Pause. So this is something very common we see in the business world, in government agencies, when there are scandals and there's a bad reputation. Sometimes they just, slap a new name on the agency to give it a facelift. There's a saying that I've heard many times: just because you put lipstick on a pig doesn't make it a lady. Back to the article. Martuscello became a face of that promise. The Marshall Project and the New York Times highlighted the supposed sea change in a 2016 article. Pause. If you manage to click on this link in the description and you get this article in front of you, read that 2016 article. I will warn you that there are images in there that are very graphic of prisoner abuse. And the article highlights abuse that has occurred over a long period of time. And most likely I will cover that article from 2016 because it's really telling and it's very damning on Docs. Back to the article, which opens with a dramatic portrait of Martuscello's amid chin high filing cabinets and a pep talk he gave OSI's 150 members. He called out the Correction Officers Union, whose aggressive use of mandatory arbitration has long prevented Docs from disciplining, let alone firing, abusive or corrupt guards. Quote, "We will do anything necessary," he said. The investigators gave him a standing ovation. Pause. Now, we do know that in fact yesterday, Daniel Martuscello III had to answer questions in regards to Robert Brooks and what's occurring in the prison system. And one thing he said was that his hands were tied by arbitration, and an outside entity makes a decision in terms of who's fired. That's probably something I will cover. That I believe it was a Senate hearing in which he had to answer questions. Back to the article. Last month, the outlets published a follow-up. Their investigation found that Docs rarely tries to discipline officers who abuse incarcerated people. In nearly 9 out of 10 cases where the agency paid cash to settle lawsuits over abuse, it made no attempt to discipline officers involved. When it did want to fire guards, the union overpowered it another 9 out of 10 times. Pause. So this is one thing that's very common in my research that comes up a lot, whether it be that docs makes very little attempt to discipline officers, even those where the state has settled civil lawsuits for abuse, beatings, murder. You figure they would definitely be able to terminate these correction officers, but that's not the case. There is a lot of data and evidence that says this is systemic. Back to the article. In a statement, the union's president, Michael Powers, told New York Focus that representatives look forward to continuing the open dialogue with Martuscello. Pause. We know with NYSDOCCS that they issued a vote of no confidence on Daniel Martuscello III. A lot of corrections officers are not on Daniel Martuscello's side, to say the least. Back to the article. Staff conduct may not have changed, but the Martuscello's family jobs had. In 2017, Martuscello became Executive Deputy Commissioner, the agency's penultimate position. By that year, one of his teacher siblings landed a job as a training specialist in the central office. And Catherine, the oldest sister, made even bigger leaps from nurse and health education coordinator to DOC's Director of Correctional Nursing Services. The greater Martuscellos also rose through the new OSI. By 2015, Martuscello's brother-in-law, then a Coxsackie corrections officer, had become a DOCS investigator. Since last year, he was promoted to Assistant Deputy Chief of OSI's Sex Crimes Division, which investigates sexual misconduct between staff and incarcerated people. And Christopher, who was accused of record tampering during his brother's promotion a decade earlier, became an Assistant Chief of Investigations. By that point, DOCS had again attracted the attention of state authorities for its internal accountability failures. In February 2022, Lucy Lang, Hochul's appointee for the State Inspector General, created a new position to oversee the hundreds of yearly complaints her office receives about DOCS. Lang's office investigates malfeasance among more than 100 agencies, commissions, authorities, and public benefit corporations, major state infrastructure projects, and welfare and gaming fraud. Even with the breadth of purview, 57% of the complaints the Inspector General received in 2021, the only full year for which such numbers are available, were related to DOCS. Quote, "It's clear that an immediate and sustained response is needed," Lang said at the time. Lang's office has since found worsening racial disparities in officer discipline of incarcerated people and likely instances of workers' compensation fraud so rampant that they outpace the resources available to combat them. DOC's leadership, including Martuscello, has remained resistant to outside intervention. In March 2022, the state enacted a landmark reform law restricting the use of solitary confinement in prisons and jails. As a New York focused series of investigations has shown, DOCS has routinely violated nearly every major facet of the law. Martuscello has tried to rationalize the obstinates. In a hearing in February, when asked why the agency has been sending hundreds with mental illnesses to solitary in violation of the reform law, Martuscello misconstrued what the law dictates. a go-to tactic for the agency. Annucci, then in charge, sat back with his arms crossed. In an earlier hearing about sexual assault in prisons and jails, Martuscello hailed the staff of OSI's Sex Crimes Division, of which his brother-in-law is now Assistant Deputy Chief, as, quote, some of the most experienced and well-trained investigators in the nation, end quote. He blamed mandatory arbitration for keeping credibly accused officers on the job, but most cases never make it to that point. Pause. There's one thing that seems to be that needs to be changed 1,000%, and that why is OSI investigating sex crimes in the Department of Corrections? Why isn't an outside law enforcement agency doing the investigations and potentially, DAs handling the prosecution? If you are an inmate in a correctional facility, you cannot consent to sexual contact. These cases of sexual abuse should not be investigated by OSI, by docs themselves. It should be done by an outside entity, a private organization. Back to the article. Legislators are now considering a bill that would limit OSI's powers of self-regulation and give the state inspector general the power to investigate prison sexual assault. Pause. So to fast forward, I don't know whether a bill of this nature was introduced, giving the power to a state inspector general. I don't know. It's something I have to look into. I would think not, based on our current climate, but I could be wrong. Back to the article. It's likely that Martuscello will lead docs until at least 2024, when the state legislature reconvenes and will be able to schedule confirmation hearings on the eventual commissioner nominee. A main hurdle for any nomination will be the Senate Corrections Committee, which will grill the chosen candidate and decide whether to recommend them for a full chamber vote. Last year, committee members declined to recommend Annucci, so Hochul yanked his nomination and allowed him to continue as acting commissioner. But that playbook might not work for his successor. In February, an Albany judge deemed Annucci's 10-year legally temporary reign a constitutional failure and denied the state's motion to dismiss a lawsuit challenging it. Salazar, the Corrections Committee chair, indicated that Martuscello would face long odds. Quote, I want to see a commissioner who can demonstrate from their record professionally that they are dedicated to transforming a broken agency, she said. But I haven't seen that commitment from anyone in DOC's top brass. If you found value in the video, like the video, share the video to help with the algorithm. And if you feel that I've earned it, please subscribe to the channel if you have not already. My goal is to give you honest and direct feedback and dig deeper than what the mainstream media is telling and showing you. Thank you, take care, and God bless.